In today's episode of Children of Heroes, we headed about 1 hour southwest from the embassy to Camberley in Surrey to talk to Madame Gerry Manolas, granddaughter of Lieutenant Bohuslav Šulc.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your grandfather served in the Czechoslovak army in the UK during the Second World War, but he was very active even as a student before the war started. Could you tell us more about this period of his life?
Yes, he was actually born in 1915 in Prague, but I think one of the defining moments of his early life was that his father, who worked for the Ministry of Agriculture, he was a manager of the stud farms. So his early life was actually quite unusual. He was able to learn to ride horses. There's lots of photographs of him riding horses, but at the age of nearly 13, his father died of a heart attack. And they had to leave where they were living and go and move in with an uncle. And he came under the wing via the scout movement of Velvyslanectví, and he got very involved, became a secretary of the scout movement for all the scouts and guides in the area that he grew up. And he also loved football, so he became a secretary of the local football club at 16. Being a leader from a very young age seemed to be in his blood. He then went to university initially in Prague, and he wasn't very happy there. He was starting a chemical engineering degree. And again, Velen advised him to come to Brno, where he was based. And so he went to the Brno University there and became involved in lots of different student movements. So he was the chair of the student union there. He was president of all the technical students in Czechoslovakia whilst he was there. And he was also responsible for press and media for the Student Agrarian Party as well. So this was all in his very early life. And he was also president of Zora, which was a cultural club for the technical students. So yes, before he was like 18, he was so involved with all these different organisations and mixing with like-minded people as well.
And what did he do after the occupation of Czechoslovakia?
When war was declared in 1939, he was on an exchange in Bulgaria. When he got to the French embassy and asked to join the French Foreign Legion straight away, and they refused him. So he had to come back, and then there was the student demonstrations in November, and I can't find out whether he was actually involved at that time. But what I do know is that his offices, the Zora offices, were raided. Luckily he wasn't there, but some of his colleagues were, and they were arrested. He managed to avoid being arrested during that time, but he was a wanted man. And the ones that were killed, the leaders, the student leaders, they were his friends. So it had a big impact on him. And I know that he actually had to leave Czechoslovakia, and he did the same route as everybody. You know, he went to Slovakia and Hungary and down into Yugoslavia. We've got labels from different hotels, and almost like the suitcase labels where you would stick them. We've still got the original ones of his journey to the south of France. He was put into the artilleries with the 3rd Battery down in Agde, and they got moved to La Nouvelle. And later on in his diaries, his artillery group was always called La Nouvelle.
And how did he come to England?
He went out through the south of France on the coal merchant ship. We've got photographs of him. He's covered in, black soot, and they're in their French uniforms, their World War I uniforms, and they escaped via the boat and came into Plymouth, and then took the train up to Cholmondeley.
And he went through a special training in Scotland, similar to, for example, Gatwick and
Kubish.
Was he supposed to be sent to a mission?
I think when they signed up and agreed to go for that training, they all knew that there was a good possibility that they could be called up. What astounds me is that he got married to my grandmother in 1942, and he did the training in the spring of 1943. So he must have felt so passionately about doing something more important that he would give up his own happiness and that of his young wife to go and do that training on the chance that he could be sent in to do special ops. They had to do a night expedition as part of their assessment, and they have to carry a great big wooden log, I think miles, running and things. And it was the worst storm to hit Scotland in years, and he talks about that in his diaries as well. So the training was really physical. And then he had to go to Ringway to do his parachute training shortly afterwards. And he actually, as he jumped out through the hatch, he cut his chin. And so when he was coming down in the parachute, his face being full of blood, he couldn't see where the ground was coming because he had blood in his face of this cut that he'd got as he jumped out.
Even in England, he continued in student-related activities.
The students came together and decided that they wanted to do something to remember those that died, not just the 8, but the ones that had been rounded up and taken to camps, been shot. And so a group of them came together from the RAF and the army, and they reformed the Czechoslovak International Student Union. And it had to be done with special dispensation from the Czech government in exile because they didn't want organisations being formed you were there to be in the army or the RAF. So they actually did go and meet President Beneš and the government ministers to get special permission, and President Beneš agreed himself. They wanted to raise the profile of students across Europe and make connections. So they would send letters to the Norwegian students who were being persecuted, and they got messages back from their government in exile. They also got a message back from President de Gaulle when they wrote to him. And they got the date of November the 17th to be remembered as International Student Union Day. And there's lots of people that claim it was them that came up with the idea. But if you read in my grandfather's diaries, he was ever the gentleman. He said, always claimed it was a group decision. There was no one person. They joined with some British leaders, and Baroness Jäger was one of them at the time, and they would go to the British universities to do speeches and talks about students coming together and that they would be the future after the war. And he went to Oxford, and there's photographs of him and of the group of them going to Oxford University and talking there, and did a big event at the Albert Hall. And then after the war, he was tasked with doing the first International Student Union conference, which was in Prague, and he was based in London. So the idea was that he would do all the arranging for London, getting people to fly in, moving them on to Prague. And in fact, he was waiting at the London airport for Fidel Castro, who was the Cuban student representative at the time. And Grandpa said he flew in and he had his guns on him. They were flying with guns at that time, and he had to get him onto a plane, and he almost missed the conference himself because fog shut the airports. In 1944, after D-Day, obviously the Czechoslovaks didn't go in immediately. They went in September. So my grandfather was part of the army that went into France, and they had to clear out the Falaise Gap. And then the Czechs, I understood, were asked to go and hold up a very strong German garrison in Dunkirk. And the idea being that they didn't want the Germans to chase the British and the Americans as they tried to go across to Berlin. My grandfather's role, part of the artillery battery, was to create skirmishes where they would antagonise the Germans and try and do secret missions in to try and get intelligence. There was one occasion where he had been asked to take a small group. The idea was that they would radio operate back to tell the Czechs where to put the artillery to get to the Germans. They were heading towards a silk factory, and the Germans counterattacked really quickly. And Grandpa managed to hide in one of the buildings in the loft, and he literally was there all night hiding. But the Czechs didn't know where he was, and he was literally being bombed by his own people. They didn't know he was in this building, so he didn't know if he was going to survive. In the morning, and the Germans caught him, and he ended up in a prisoner of war camp. And then there was a prisoner of war exchange. Only about 10 days later, and he went to Bruges, so he saw Liberation Day in Bruges. He went back to Czechoslovakia and he went and lived with his mother originally and the family again. We were really fortunate. He hadn't lost any family members, but he had lost obviously a lot of his friends, and he found out that his best friend had been horrendously tortured by the Gestapo, and his best friend's father wrote to him. I have a letter that's extremely moving, talking about him visiting his friend in prison in those last days, knowing he was going to be hung. But this friend had said to his father, go to Slava, Slava will look after you. He became a manager of a chemical plant. He could go out and he would go to different factories doing industrial assessments, and this allowed him to go into the forbidden zone, the land between the Germany and Czechoslovakia, and he escaped using that route. He was really under a lot of pressure by the communist government after 1948, and because my great-grandparents were living in London, he was able to send my grandmother and my mother and my aunt over on the auspices of going on holiday to see their great-grandmother in London, and then he picked his time to use this route out. And he went over to the American part of Germany, and one of his student friends from the student union, Palachek, was actually the Czech ambassador to Germany at the time. So he got in touch and said, look, I've escaped, and he was able to get him the visa then he needed to get back to the UK. They literally left everything, shut the door on their flat, all their possessions were left.
And what he did in England after returning?
After he returned, he got a job as a chemical engineer with ICI in the north of England, not far actually from Cholmondeley. Then he ended up being the deputy works manager of the largest soda ash factory in Europe by the end of his career, which is pretty amazing for a foreigner. Although he'd fought with the British, they were just seen as foreigners, and Grandma and Grandpa were really keen to blend with the British as quickly as possible. So in the family home, they stopped speaking Czech in front of my mother and in front of my aunt. So English became the language at home always. Education was everything. I mean, my grandfather always believed if you had an education, you would then be able to get a good job. If you had a job, you had money, which meant you were independent. You didn't need to rely on anybody. So there was a lot of pressure on my mum and my auntie as young girls. The way it affected my mum is my mum rebelled. She was the wild one, I think. My relationship with my grandparents was lovely. They were just grandparents. My grandfather didn't have this history. I didn't know this history about him. I always remember on the wall he had a photograph, a signed photograph from President Benes, and he also had a photograph of Masaryk, the first Masaryk, the president, amongst family photographs. That's how highly he thought of them. Grandfather still ran a lot of events, so as a young girl I would go to the Czech events. But again, they were just a fun place to be. And I do remember their house always being full of the veterans. As I see them now, they were just family friends.
You yourself worked as a teacher, but later changed your career path.
My career path changed from being a teacher, which I was 11 years, I did primary, and I changed and I went into recruitment. And I realised there are a lot of teachers that were in jobs they were unhappy with, not with teaching, but the school that they were in. And actually, if I could help them match the right school with the right teacher, you would keep a teacher in education and they would be happier. So that was the recruitment move. And now I'm doing recruitment for a company that does retirement living. In the UK, there are a lot of people who are elderly, who don't live near their families. So the idea is they move into smaller communities where they can have their own flat and their own independence, and there's care and support staff to help them. So my role is to recruit the staff there.
You have attended your first ceremony commemorating the legacy of the Czechoslovak army here in the UK at the age of 13. And
Yes.
You became a leading figure in the associations that take care of the legacy of Czechoslovak soldiers. How did you get involved and what's your current role?
Yes, the first event I attended was with my grandparents. It was at Cholmondeley, and it was the 40th anniversary of the Czechoslovak soldiers coming to the UK. And I got to wear my first Czech national costume, I felt amazing in that. And then the second day we had a parade through Chester. And at Chester Cathedral there is a stone that's been created by Frantabelski, and it's in the wall, and I remember that stone being unveiled on the day as a memorial. And I remember my grandfather in the parade, so all these veterans with their medals parading with the Royal British Legion, and my grandfather was right at the back. He wasn't at the front, he was just quietly at the back. And I really remembered that so that you can lead from behind. You don't need to lead from the front. So that had a big effect on me. My grandfather is buried at Brookwood, and I went over, and at that time, unfortunately, the civilian plot was not looking very well cared for. I spoke to my grandmother about it, and she put me in contact with the Free Czechoslovak Air Force group, which was mainly the veterans out of London, or mainly RAF. I'm not RAF, I'm an army girl. I said, but can I help you take care of Brookwood? And you can imagine they were more than delighted, a young person coming in. And so I just started by literally going over and tending the grass, working with the cemetery to try and get them to take care of the plot. Unfortunately, about 2014, the last veterans were passing away of that association. There was a lot of talk that when the last veteran died, that would be the end of the associations. And I thought that was really sad. But well, why does it need to end? Because they've gone doesn't mean that their stories have stopped. And so in 2018, after General Schwartz passed away, I spoke to some of the families that had been attending the Brookwood events and said, what are your thoughts? Do you think we should do this? They said, well, we'll do it, but you'll need to lead, Gerry. A small group of us came together and we created the Memorial Association for Free Czechoslovak Veterans. Obviously, we couldn't do what the veterans were doing, but we could remember what they did and continue the events that they chose. And we've managed to grow it, and we've got the children involved at the Czech and Slovak schools, which I am so thrilled about.
And what exactly does your association do?
We continue the memorial events first and foremost. That's 2 Brookwood events each year, and we've taken over Cholmondeley as well. We also use our social media to bring different groups together. So we work with the group out of Leamington Spa. We've also got other connections with Scotland, with Veronica, who's the consul in Scotland in Edinburgh. So we've worked with creating links with Araseg as well. We do what we can to create new information panels. So we've put 2 new information panels in at Cholmondeley Castle, one at Brookwood, and we're hoping people to try and discover their own family history.
Do you have anything more you would like to add?
I'm just really proud to have my Czech heritage and hope that, other families will get to have the same feeling as well.